That's why this Ryan budget must be totally defeated. Mr. President, with that, I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
The senator from Vermont.
I want to congratulate my colleague, Senator Harkin, for his remarks, and I certainly agree with him. And I want to just pick up, perhaps, or amplify a point that Senator Harkin just made. There was a remarkable story, a frightening story, in the New York Times today. I don't know that people have digested it, but the headline is, "Life expectancy shrinks for less educated whites in the United States." And let me quote, generally speaking, the trend for life expectancy in the United States and all over the world has been going up. And the goal of a good society and a strong health care system is to see that people live longer, healthier, happier lives. But as a result of the devastating attacks in a variety of ways on the working class of this country over a period of years, not just starting yesterday, this is where we are. Let me quote from this article, and I hope people hear this because this is really shocking stuff. And I quote, "The steepest declines in life expectancy were for white women without a high school diploma who lost 5 years of life between 1990 and 2008, whose life expectancy went down by 5 years. This is astronomical." And going back to the article said Jay Olshansky, a public health professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago and the lead investigator on the study, published last month in Health Affairs. By 2008, what happened is between 1990 and 2008, an 18-year period, life expectancy for white women without a high school diploma declined by 5 years. White men lacking a high school diploma lost 3 years of life. Life expectancy for both blacks and Hispanics of the same education level rose, the data showed, rose. But blacks overall do not live as long as whites, while Hispanics live longer than both whites and blacks. And so let's digest what that means. I held as chairman of the Subcommittee on Aging and Primary Care last year. We held a hearing entitled "Poverty as a Death Sentence." Poverty as a death sentence. And what that hearing pointed out, that people who are in the top 20% live, as I recall, about 6 years longer than people in the bottom 20%. But what new evidence is suggesting is that people without a high school degree, the least educated people in America, often the poorest people in America, are now seeing, both women and men, a significant decline in their life expectancy, moving in exactly the wrong direction. Now, the authors of the study are not exactly sure why this is taking place. Many low-income, uneducated people are using drugs, cutting short their lives. Healthcare, lack of health care, is certainly one of the reasons. More and more low-income people can't access health care, which is why it is so important that we defeat the Obama-Ryan effort to devastate, as Senator Harkin just said, Medicaid, and throw millions and millions of people off of health insurance. If life expectancy for low-income people is now going down, think of what it will mean if we throw millions more off of Medicaid. It is a death sentence. Mr. President, I also want to say a word on the issue of Social Security, and I want to thank you and Senators Whitehouse and Senators Begich for joining me yesterday in releasing a letter which had 29 signatures on it from members of the United States Senate, and that letter was pretty simple. What it said is that Social Security has not added a nickel to the deficit because Social Security, of course, is funded by the payroll tax. And it said that Social Security has a $2.7 trillion surplus, can pay out all benefits to eligible Americans for the next 21 years. So that it is absolutely wrong and bad public policy to be talking about cutting Social Security within the context of deficit reduction when Social Security has nothing to do with the deficit. The reason that we are in a deficit situation today in a significant way, the reason that we have gone a very long way in the wrong direction since January 2001, when Bill Clinton left office with a $236 billion surplus, has nothing to do with Social Security. It has everything to do with Bush and those people who voted for 2 wars and forgot to pay for them, added it to the deficit. Those people who gave huge tax breaks, much of it going to the richest people in this country, forgot to pay for it, passed the Medicare Part D prescription drug program, forgot to pay for it, and a recession caused by Wall Street, which resulted in lower revenue coming into the federal government. Those are the reasons why we're in a deficit, not because of Social Security. And what concerns me, Mr. President, is that 4 years ago, I understand Republicans want to cut Social Security. That's what they do. They're not very sympathetic to Social Security, have opposed Social Security for years, don't believe the government should be involved in retirement security, want to balance the budget on the backs of the elderly, the sick, the children, the poor, give tax breaks to the rich. I understand that. More and more Americans understand that. But I'll tell you what I am concerned about, Mr. President. I am concerned about President Obama. 4 years ago, the President was very, very clear on this issue. And when the President was running for election against Senator McCain, this is what he told AARP, and ironically, he just spoke to AARP, I believe it was today. So 4 years ago, same venue. This is what he said 4 years ago. John McCain's campaign has suggested that the best answer for the growing pressures on Social Security might be to cut cost of living adjustments or raise the retirement age. Let me be clear, I will not do either, end of quote, candidate Barack Obama 4 years ago. Well, Barack Obama is in the White House now. We have people like billionaire Pete Peterson, who's been pushing deficit reduction on the backs of working people for years now, spending huge amounts of money to make sure we do deficit reduction, not by asking the wealthiest people in this country to pay their fair share, by balancing it on the backs of the elderly, the children, the sick, and the poor. These guys have come up with a strategy called the chain CPI. Now, nobody in America outside of Capitol Hill knows what the chain CPI is. And what it is a new formulation as to how we determine cost of living adjustments, COLAs, for seniors. And what these economists have decided, these right-wing economists have decided, is COLAs today are formulated in a way that are too generous for American seniors and for disabled veterans. And they want to reformulate how we come up with these COLAs. If they get their way, and I have a great deal of fear that unless some of us stop them, unless the American people stop them, they will in fact get their way. What this will mean is that if you're 65 years of age today, by the time you're 75, you'll lose about $560 a year in your benefits. And if you're 65 years of age today, in 20 years when you're 85, you'll lose $1,000 a year. So let me be very clear. I do not believe that you should move to a deficit reduction on the backs of a senior citizen living on $14,000 or $15,000 a year and take $1,000 away from them and then get on the floor of the Senate and talk about how we have to give more tax breaks to billionaires. I think that is not only morally inexcusable, I think it is bad economics. Bad economics. And what we're talking about in this so-called chain CPI, which will cut benefits for seniors, you're also talking about cutting VA benefits for disabled veterans. So I want to hear all these tough guys here who think we should balance the budget on the backs of the elderly and the children. Let them get up here and tell us why you think that when somebody fought in a war to defend the United States, maybe they lost their legs or their eyes or their arms, you want to cut their benefits and then you want to give tax breaks to billionaires. Well, the American people don't want to do that. So I think we've got to get on the phones right now. We've got to call our senators, and we've got to call members of the House, and we have got to call President Obama. Mr. President, 4 years ago, you told us you weren't going to cut Social Security. Is that still your position? 4 years ago, you came up with an idea that is, in fact, exactly the right idea. You made the point that multimillionaires are contributing the same amount of money into the Social Security Trust Fund as somebody making $110,000. And 4 years ago, you made the point that if we lift that cap, and you don't have to start at 110, you go up to 250. You lift that cap above 250,000, you could bring in enough revenue to fund Social Security for the next 75 years. That was your position, Mr. President, 4 years ago. Is that your position today? Are you going to stand up to the Republicans and the Wall Street folks who want us to cut Social Security? So that is where we are right now. Last point that I want to make. I want to comment on the much-discussed remarks that Governor Romney made that were released recently in that video that has gone all over the Internet. And there's a lot that can be said about it, and I suspect everybody has said a lot that can be said about it. I just want to pick up on one point, and maybe I feel strongly about this point, Mr. President, because I am the son of a working-class family, of a father who never made a lot of money but worked hard his entire life, and of a mother who raised her kids as best she could. So I take this kind of personally. And this is what Mr. Romney said in connection with the famous 47% of the people who don't pay taxes, which is not really true, of course. As we know, they pay Social Security tax and gasoline taxes, Medicare taxes. But be that as it may, that's not the issue I want to get to. This is what he said. He said, my job, Mr. Romney says, my job is not to worry about those people. I'll never convince them they should take personal responsibility and care for their lives, end of quote. Let me repeat that. I will never convince them that they should take personal responsibility and care for their lives, end of quote. Well, he was talking about my parents. He was talking about the parents of millions of people who worked hard their whole lives and don't need advice from a multimillionaire who went to elite schools and had all the money and privileges that his family could provide him. We don't need advice from him to families who have worked and struggled their whole lives to, in fact, take personal responsibility to make sure that their kids did well. That is an incredibly arrogant statement from a guy surrounded by money speaking to millionaires who should not be making that statement. People on Social Security today, people on Medicare in many cases have worked their entire lives, have done the best that they can to provide for their kids, have seen their kids go to college. Many of the people on Social Security, Medicare, have fought in wars defending this country. They do not need advice from a multimillionaire about how they should take personal responsibility for their lives. That is an insulting remark, and it would become Governor Romney really to apologize for that remark. And with that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor.
President. Senator from Utah.
And might I ask how much time I have?
There's no control time.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
You have as much time as you like. For
Thank
now.
you so much.
Anyway.
Mr. President, I have to say I always enjoy my colleague from Vermont. He's a very sincere, dedicated man, and I like him. There's no use kidding about it. You can't help but like him in my eyes. But I don't know any senator in this body, Republican senator, who wants to cut Social Security. We want to save Social Security. I don't know anybody who really wants to cut Medicare or Medicaid. We want to save Medicare and Medicaid. And everybody in their right mind who looks at this knows that we've got to do some things and change some things, or we're not going to have Medicaid and Medicare for our people, and we're not going to have Social Security continue. It's in better shape than Medicaid and Medicare. It's only $18 trillion in unfunded liability, where Medicaid and Medicare are around $38.5 trillion. At least Medicare is, and Medicaid's almost that bad. So, you know, and with regard to Mitt Romney, yes, he was inarticulate. There's no way in this world Mitt Romney meant his comments to be taken the way they have been taken by the left in this country. All he's saying is that, look, there are too many people riding in the wagon, not enough people pulling the wagon. And we're going to have to get jobs for those who should be outside the wagon, pulling the wagon, and help them to have the self-esteem that comes from working. That's what the whole welfare bill of 1996 was all about, in having a work requirement. We're going to help you, we're going to subsidize you, we're going to give you job training, but at the end of a certain period of time, if you don't have a job, you're off the dole. And that's just, and literally two-thirds, almost two-thirds of the people who've been on the dole, some for generations, went to work. I mean, now that's the Republican approach, to get people back to work, to get this economy moving again, and not particularly to hurt anybody. And so you can exaggerate these things to a point where sometimes it becomes confusing to the American people, and that's not right either. I know Mitt Romney. I know how he cares for people. I know what he did when he was a bishop in the LDS Church, in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I was a bishop when I was running for Senate. And I've got to tell you, I spent at least 30 hours a week at my own time and expense, because there is no paid clergy in the LDS faith other than the general authorities. And those are very few people. And we all volunteer our time, but we help people from every walk of life. Now, I'm here today to talk about some very important things that are related to what I've just been saying. Mr. President, there's been much discussion by President Obama about the source of our current economic and fiscal challenges. The President seems to suggest that we could easily return to the prosperity of the 1990s by adopting the policies of President Clinton, particularly by raising taxes to the level they were at during his presidency. At the recent Democrat National Convention, President Clinton himself made a similar argument. But the positive economic and fiscal history of the 1990s was not owing to higher tax rates. And the economic and fiscal challenges that we face today, in particular, our $16 trillion national debt and exploding entitlement spending programs, cannot be fixed by higher tax rates. During his convention speech, President Clinton claimed that President Obama inherited a damaged economy, put a floor under the crash, began the road to recovery, and laid the foundation for a modern, well-balanced economy. Tell that to the 12.5 million unemployed Americans who continue to struggle with unemployment. Explain to Americans how redistribution, massive expansion of refundable tax credits, balloon transfer payments, and an interventionist Federal Reserve represent a foundation for future growth of the economy. Explain how this economy is, quote, well-balanced, unquote, when government spending represents as much as 25% of GDP. Debt is higher than the entire year's worth of the output of the economy, And we have an activist Federal Reserve which has increased its balance sheet by well over $1 trillion. President Obama does admit that we are not where we need to be. So instead he asks whether we are better off than when he took office. And he answers in the affirmative. Putting aside the rhetoric and spin and considering the facts, this is a dubious claim at best. Relative to the beginning of 2009, when President Obama took office, jobs are down by 261,000, and unemployment remains above 8%. But wait, Democrats say the president cannot be held responsible for bad things that happened during his presidency. Those things were inherited or due to Europe or caused by uncontrollable forces. All right, then. Let's look at the president's jobs record after the end of the recession, which the National Bureau of Economic Research says was June of 2009. Since then, job growth under President Obama has been only 73,600 jobs per month on average, far too weak to move the unemployment rate below 8%. Democrats say the only reason we don't have more jobs is because Republicans will not agree to more Keynesian stimulus. Never mind that the previous dose, which cost over $800 billion and was promised to deliver unemployment below 8%, failed to get unemployment down. Remember those promised shovel-ready jobs that became a source of amusement to the president. Remember the promised infrastructure. Americans should ask themselves where all those things are. Where are the jobs? While the president makes claims of saving millions of jobs because of stimulus magic, the Federal Reserve claims millions of jobs saved from its so-called quantitative easing. There you have it. The president's foundation of well-balanced economic growth rests on debt finance, Keynesian stimulus, and Federal Reserve stimulus. Absent anything but a dismal record on jobs, President Obama has decided to run on President Clinton's record. So let's consider President Clinton's rose-colored nostalgia, a revisionist history adopted by President Clinton, or President Obama and his surrogates. President Clinton's view goes like this. I came into office with a weak economy. I raised taxes. The economy boomed. President Clinton's depiction of the roaring 90s is missing a few chapters. In his first years in office, Democrats controlled Congress. He and the Democrats raised income taxes and gas taxes. He tried to impose a BTU energy tax, attempted a government takeover of health care, known as Hillary Care, and proposed a $31 billion stimulus while putting off welfare reform. The first few years of the Clinton presidency can fairly be characterized as prioritizing tax and spend economic policy. But Hillary Care failed, and American voters decided to make some changes. They faced uncertainty over taxes, health care, energy costs, deficits, and runaway government spending. After 2 years of complete Democrat control of Washington, American voters decided in 1994 that Republican control of the Senate and House was desirable. Does this sound familiar? A new Democrat in the White House, complete Democrat control of Congress, prioritizing higher taxes, a government takeover of the nation's health care system, and more spending. Followed by a popular uprising that gave some Republican balance in Congress. The first Republican Congress in over 40 years. But in contrast to President Obama's refusal to heed the message of the 2010 election, President Clinton listened to the American people and moved to the political center. He embraced a Republican goal of a balanced budget, and after 2 vetoes, signed GOP welfare reform legislation shortly before the 1996 election. In 1996, President Clinton was reelected, but Republicans retained control of Congress. Now, President Obama claims that these were the good old days because President Clinton raised taxes. Let's consider that tax landscape. President Clinton did raise the top income tax rate in 1993, and Democrats credit that increase with shrinking the deficit and unleashing future economic growth. However, he also agreed with Republicans in 1997 to cut the capital gains tax rate to 20% from 28%, which contributed to revenue and economic growth. I know because it was the Hatch-Lieberman bill that they followed in doing that. Joe Lieberman had the guts to stand up on that issue, as did I. And it happened. The Democrats said we would lose revenues. The revenues tripled because people didn't feel gouged anymore. Funny how that chapter gets left out of the Democrats' 1990 story. In 2000, President Clinton left office with federal receipts measuring 20.6% of GDP, well above the 17.5% seen in 1992 before he took office. But those receipts were boosted by capital gains realizations associated with the Internet stock bubble that formed toward the end of the Clinton presidency. Even more notable, and something that Democrats do not discuss in relation to the Clinton presidency, is that he left office with federal outlays measuring 18.2% of GDP, significantly below the 22.1% seen in 1992 before Clinton took office. Significant reductions in federal outlays as a share of GDP occurred once Republicans gained control of the Congress. In contrast, President Obama has presided over the largest spending spree since World War II, with outlays as high as 25.2% of the entire economy, something that hasn't happened since the height of World War II, when the federal government almost took over the economy. In his 1996 State of the Union speech, President Clinton took credit for budget improvements and spending restraint imposed by Republicans in Congress. He famously stated that the era of big government is over. But in a nod to the Republicans' role in containing the budget, in that same speech he said, quote, "I compliment the Republican leadership and membership for the energy and determination you have brought to this task of balancing the budget," unquote. Compare that to the sentiment of President Obama when we tried it their way and it didn't work. President Obama and those Democrats who embraced the history of the 1990s also conveniently neglect to give any credit to Ronald Reagan, whose ending of the Cold War led to a peace dividend, which helped President Clinton to curtail growth in federal defense outlays. In summary, the Democratic nostalgia for the 1990s is based on a very limited recollection of events. They see that Clinton raised taxes, the economy grew, and the budget improved. Apparently, correlation is all that is necessary to establish causality in their world, particularly when it works in their favor. What also gets left out of the standard Democratic history is a stock price bubble that was actually the basis of much of the growth in the 1990s. So, Mr. President, let's consider the Clinton bubble further and ask what it could possibly mean for the recent financial crisis. One of the charges levied by President Clinton, which echoes a familiar Democrat talking point, is that Americans should be wary of Republicans because we champion deregulation that, quote, got us into this mess, unquote. But who generated the mess? The mess was a devastating financial crisis. And who sowed the seeds of that crisis? First, consider the significant financial deregulation under the Bush administration. The fact is, there wasn't any. So where did the deregulation in finance come from? Whose policies promoted financial markets prone to bubbles and irrational exuberance and bailouts? It was under President Clinton's watch that warnings were ignored about riskiness of derivatives. It was under his watch that risky derivatives led to the collapse of the hedge fund long-term capital management, or LTCM, and to an eventual bailout arranged by the Fed. It was under his watch that the Fed left market participants with a belief that should there be significant market turbulence, the Fed would be there to bail them out. It was under his watch that the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act was signed into law, repealing part of the Glass-Steagall Act of 1933. And as a basis for strong fundamental growth in the economy, President Clinton's stock bubble was lacking and numerous companies crashed. A bursting stock bubble, along with corporate accounting scandals, which included the Enron debacle, left a mess for President Bush, who, by the way, didn't whine about it for 4 straight years. It was under President Clinton's watch that significant growth began in risky subprime mortgage lending, which ended up at the heart of the recent financial crisis, and warnings were ignored, even the warning by the New York Times in the late 90s. His presidency pushed financial deregulation, and it showed inattention to the beginnings of speculative excesses in housing and mortgage markets. The financial crisis was indeed severe, and seeds of the crisis were sown during President Clinton's presidency and then nurtured by many years of regulatory inattention. To say that Republican deregulation caused the recent crisis is simply false. Mr. President, we have faced crises before. President Obama is not unique in this respect. What is unique is how poorly he has handled our economic and fiscal crisis. In February 2009, President Obama said that his presidency would be a, quote, one-term proposition, unquote, if the economy did not recover within 3 years. Well, it's been over 3 years and the economy has not recovered. Therefore, by the President's own metric, his administration should be a one-time proposition. No, he wants 4 more years to do more of the same. Mr. President, the President has no plan. I get a kick how the media is always badgering Romney about where's your plan when he wrote no apology and it's plenty of the plan is in there. He's more than expressed a plan. Now, the President claims to want to get our deficit under control by raising taxes on the wealthy and keeping the tax burden on middle-class Americans where it is. But the President's tax proposals don't work, as we learned from his Buffett tax, which fell over $800 billion short of his plan to use the tax to pay for a long-term alternative minimum tax patch. The unpleasant fact facing the President is that there simply isn't enough revenue from taxing the so-called rich to fill his desires of permanently larger government. Taxing business owners who the President thinks are undeserving of their success will simply not pay for his redistributionist dreams. Of course, contrary to President Obama's disdain for business, Americans who own and operate businesses did build them, and they also paid taxes which built the roads and bridges that they use. And make no mistake, business owners and American workers did build America. Mr. President, they did build that. Now, Mr. President, let me just go back just a little bit here. I made the comment with regard to all of this media criticism of Governor Romney, that he was inarticulate in a private meeting where no press was invited, and he's the first to admit that. And he certainly has tried to explain it since. But he's right. He's right that there are at least 47% of Americans who don't pay a nickel or a penny of income taxes. The standard answer by my friends on the other side is, well, they pay payroll taxes. Well, everybody does that. That's Social Security, basically. We all do that. But 23 million people get refundable tax credits that are more than they pay in payroll taxes. And a little less than 16 million get refundable tax credits that are a little bit more, that are more than, they get refundable tax credits that are more than they and their employers pay in payroll taxes. Now, do Republicans want to tax the truly poor? Heavens no. This is a great country. We can take care of the truly poor. The question is, are all of those in the, according to the joint tax bottom, 51% who do not pay a penny of income taxes, are all of those in the truly poor category? The answer is no. Well, what does Governor Romney mean? He means that, like I said at the beginning, there are too many people who are riding in the wagon and not enough pulling. It isn't their fault in many cases, except there are millions who won't even look for a job now who are perfectly capable of holding a job because they're discouraged, and I don't blame them with this economy. But they ought to be looking for jobs anyway. I'd do anything if it was me. I'd do anything to be able to support my family other than be on federal largesse. But that's the way it is today. Governor Romney's goal in this life is to pull us out of this mess, get spending down to no more than 20% of the GDP, which would be a remarkable downturn in spending compared to what we have today, and also get people to work. Get them to where they have the self-esteem that comes from working, that which we did on welfare reform in 1996, and I worked hard on that bill, as did so many others at that time. And give them the self-esteem that comes from supporting themselves. And that's what he meant. That's what is meant here. And frankly, let's just be honest. The mainstream media is not for Governor Romney. We all know that. Anybody with brains knows that. All you got to do is watch it. And that's been the way it's been here ever since I've been in the Congress. And frankly, they're not going to treat Governor Romney fairly. But I'll tell you this. Mitt Romney will put America to work. He knows how to do it. This man has been successful in everything he has ever undertaken to do. He doesn't need this job as president, but he's running because he knows this country's in trouble. He knows it isn't following good economic practices. He knows that this administration is a disaster from a job standpoint, among other things. He could have the most lovely life. And he's taken this kind of unmitigated crap in trying to do that which he knows is right for this country. I think we ought to be more fair in these presidential elections, and I wish the media was split 50-50. It's not. Everybody knows it. I care a great deal for our friends in the media, but there's nobody with brains that doesn't understand that it's heavily, especially the mainstream right here in Washington, D.C., New York, Los Angeles, et cetera, is heavily stacked in favor of President Obama. And I like President Obama, too. I've known him as a senator. I've known him as a friend. And I've known him as a president. And what I'm saying here is that he hasn't done the job. I don't believe he's going to do the job. I don't think he has the background to do the job. And for us to not put somebody who does in there may be catastrophic for the future of our country. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Mississippi.
I ask unanimous consent that my friend from Alabama and I be allowed to engage in a colloquy.
Without objection.
Would the senator yield for an unanimous consent request?
I'd be delighted to yield.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that my full remarks be placed in the record at this time.
Without objection. Senator from Mississippi.
Let me say from the outset that this Senate and this nation are profoundly fortunate to have had the services of Senator Orrin Hatch for decades and decades. And the speech that he just delivered to this body was profound in so many ways and true in so many ways. And it was made at 10 minutes till 6 on a Friday night when perhaps Americans are looking elsewhere. But just so much of what the senator said is absolutely the truth, and our country needs to hear it. And I appreciate him coming and delivering it in such a talented way.
Well, if the senator would yield, I want to thank my friend and colleague. I really appreciate it, and I enjoy serving with him, and as I do with everybody in this body.
Well, Senator Wicker just talked there a minute about this. What do you think? Wouldn't it be great to have a chairman of the Finance Committee named Senator Orrin Hatch?
Well, it would be. It would be. And I think with the leadership of people like Senator Hatch, we would not be ignoring what we have out there facing us in America today, and that is nothing less than a financial crisis. And the senator from Utah is correct. The President of the United States is doing everything he can to change the subject from that real central issue of our faltering economy. And yes, the mainstream media is out there playing Trivial Pursuit and talking about everything that is not important and that is a distraction. But you just cannot get around the facts. And the facts are these. We have a $16 trillion staggering debt in this country, and this government has added $6 trillion in 3.5 short years. Just a fact, and you can't get around it. You also cannot get around these absolute truths. We've had no appropriation bills come out of this Senate this year. Now, our Republican friends in the House, it's a different story. They've done their work, and they've passed product after product like they're supposed to do. And my hat is off to the chair, the gentleman from Kentucky, Chairman Rogers, for getting the appropriation bills done. We haven't done that in this Democrat-led Senate. We haven't passed a defense bill, first time in half a century that we will have gone through a whole session and not passed a defense bill at a time when we have troops at war, troops in harm's way. Our men and women putting themselves at risk and fighting and dying. We don't have a defense bill.
Well, Senator
Yes, sir.
Wicker, isn't it amazing that we don't have a defense bill? You serve on the Armed Services Committee, as I do, and it came out of committee unanimously, bipartisan vote. And for some reason, the Democratic leadership has failed to bring up the bill to the floor for the first time in 50 years. Isn't that amazing?
No question about it. And it does not, it doesn't make me comfortable to point fingers, but there's no getting around the fact there's one person on this planet that can call a bill up before this Senate, and that's the majority leader of the Senate, hasn't brought the defense bill. We also don't have a budget resolution. Now, again, our friends in the House, the Republican-led House under Speaker Boehner, have, during the 2 years of their stewardship, brought budget resolutions to the floor, passed them, sent them over here, only to be ignored. Now, the President has submitted budgets. Didn't get a single vote in the House of Representatives, didn't get a single vote when we called it up as sort of a test vote here in the Senate. But this Senate, under the leadership of the Democratic majority, has not followed the statute. It says you bring a budget resolution up every year. Haven't done it. We're into our 4th year now. But the senator and I were talking, and I'll toss it to him on this. Beyond that, they don't have a budget deficit reduction plan. It's one thing to have a resolution. It could say anything. But what the American people need, what our future generations are crying out for, is a plan to reduce this debt. And I look forward and hope to see the day when my friend from Alabama is chairman of the Senate Budget Committee. And I would just ask him to assure everyone within the sound of our voices today that under his leadership as chairman of the Budget Committee, we will see a budget resolution brought to the floor and debated according to statute.
Senator Wicker, you ask a very good question, and every American needs to be thinking about that. And I have given a lot of thought to it. We haven't had a budget in 3 years, 1,241 days. We've not had a budget brought to the passed on this floor of the Senate. Didn't even bring one up this year. If we are blessed by the American people, we, the Republican senators, to have a majority in this body, and why I'm honored to have the opportunity to lead the Budget Committee, we will have a budget. Failure is not an option. It cannot be that we will not comply with the law. But more than that, Senator Wicker, the question is, we have got to have a plan to get us off the course to financial disaster. And the budget is the way you lay that plan out. And don't you agree that the difficulty our Democrat colleagues had is, I suppose, anything they thought they could agree on and bring forth would not be popular with the American people. And they didn't want to subject themselves to having to debate it on the floor and having to vote on amendments as the Budget Act allows, even though you can pass a budget with a simple majority, cannot be filibustered. And I guess what I would ask you, Senator Wicker, when you don't bring a budget because you can't agree or are unwilling to step forward with a plan, what you're really doing is failing to provide the leadership we were elected to give to America. And you don't have a plan that you're willing to announce to try to get us on the right course. A budget, wouldn't you agree, is sort of a plan to deal with the crisis that we're facing, and we've not seen one in this body.
Well, it's one of our basic responsibilities. As I said, the discretionary part of it is the appropriation bills. Not one single appropriation bill has cleared this Senate during 2012. And yes, indeed, at a time when we're running the debt of $6 trillion, when we're seeing our friends and allies across the ocean teetering on the brink, we're seeing all the warning signs, and we have time in this capital city, the shining city on a hill, to be an example to the world. I can only answer your question by saying the President's budget was so unpopular it didn't get a single vote. There's not one single, the most left-wing, left-leaning senator would not step forward and embrace that budget, and I can only assume that what they would have suggested would have been very much like that. But when you're in the majority, you have a responsibility to lead. We all have a responsibility to lead, Mr. President. But in particular, when you're the only vehicle for bringing bills to the floor, you have a responsibility to lead in a time of crisis. And that's what we've been lacking here in the United States Senate. Of course, we do have the Federal Reserve. Leader of the Federal Reserve announced the other day he's going to print $40 billion extra each month. Now, that's his solution. I would counsel against this. I think most members on this side would counsel against this, but at least as a plan. We've had no indication from the leaders of the Senate whether they like that plan or not. We do know this. We passed a stimulus bill over here. It cost almost $1 trillion. Unemployment has gone up under this bill that was supposed to jumpstart the economy. It was supposed to do two things: jumpstart the economy and keep the unemployment rate 8% or less. Of course, we know for 42 months now the unemployment rate has been over 8%. And the last thing the stimulus bill did was jumpstart the economy. It's been going downhill ever since. It's hard to put a pretty face on this situation. And, of course, the result, a staggering 23 million American citizens either don't have a job, are underemployed, or have stopped looking for work. In addition, of course, the President promised in 2008, you remember that promise, Senator Sessions, that he would cut the deficit in half by the end of his first term. Well, this is the end of his first term. The deficit has mushroomed, not been cut in half. And so we're in a financial crisis, and everybody on television seems to be trying to paint a rosy picture and avoid the subject. So I am glad to join with my friend, the budget ranking member, and to suggest that we will have a plan, as House Republicans had a specific plan in black and white to address this unbelievable financial crisis that our country faces.
Well, that's a challenge that we have to face. It's not easy. It'll be a challenge and difficult, force us to make difficult choices. But I feel, Senator Wicker, how I feel very frustrated. You know, we were small towns in America where we grew up, and if you had a tough choice to make and somebody came up with an idea and stood up and defended it, you respected them even if you didn't agree with it. And if you didn't have a better plan and all you did was criticize their plan, people wouldn't think much of you, would they?
That's exactly.
That's the way real people live. So what we've got in this body, and when the budget budgets were brought up. They brought up the House budget, the Ryan budget. We brought up the President's budget. Senator Toomey and others had a budget. Every one of them were brought up. Our Democratic colleagues voted against every one of them. Not in one instance setting out before the people what they believed in, what they would advocate for, what they would fight for, what they believed would fix the American economy and put us on the right track. And they have invested a tremendous amount of effort in attacking Congressman Ryan and the House's budget. And let me just say this about that budget. Any budget's going to be subject to some complaint here or there, but it was historic. It would change the debt course of America. It would reduce our deficit by $3.5 trillion. It would create economic growth. It was designed not just to be a budget-cutting, frugal budget, but also to try to create growth and prosperity in this country and get this country moving again and get business hiring again. It's a historic, good budget that would change the debt course of America and put us on the right path. And all we've heard from our colleagues, without anything themselves, is criticism of him. And I believe that the House has, like you said, fulfilled their duty.
I'll tell you what else it would do, Senator and Mr. President. It would tell the truth to the American people about what we're facing. And I like what our young nominee for Vice President said. We've got time to fix this, but we need to fix it, and we don't have much time. And speaking of telling the truth, I'd like to pivot, if I could, to a question that has been raised on this floor in the last couple of days about this Senate's lack of compliance with the Budget Act. Now, there's not a more learned expert on the Federal Budget Act of 1974 than my friend from Alabama, and I would just ask him to clarify, if he would, the statements and misstatements and charges and countercharges that have been made about the fact that there has not been a budget resolution brought to this floor for consideration and amendment.
I thank Senator Wicker for raising this point, because we need to discuss it. And the American people need to ask themselves, who's telling the truth about this? Who's accurate about this? Because a group of us 40 or more Republicans expressed frustration with the lack of action in this body, the likes of which we've never seen perhaps in our history, really, with regard to not passing an appropriations bill. Historic research has been done. We've not passed a single appropriation bill 2 times, 2010 and this year, both under this Democratic leadership. Only time in history no appropriation bill has ever been passed. But Senator Reid yesterday used this language. Kind of hurt my feelings, because I said we didn't have a budget. I'm ranking member of the Budget Committee. A half a dozen, or maybe 10 or 15 Republicans talked about not having a budget. He said it's a lie to say we don't have a budget, close quote. Now, I don't know if that violates the rules of the Senate about personal attack, but I don't try not to use that word, lie. I try not to say my colleagues are lying. And if I ever would say something like that, I'd want to be sure I had absolute proof to back it up. And that's a responsibility. We like Harry Reid. He can be so charming, and I consider him a friend. I really do. He's always treated me fairly on the floor. But I got to tell you, the majority leader shouldn't have said that. First of all, it's not accurate. For example, Senator Reid announced unequivocally he had no intention of passing a budget. This is what he said back in last year. There is no need to have a Democratic budget, in my opinion. Well, as a statutory requirement, unfortunately, it doesn't say you go to jail if you don't pass one. And then the people are crying out for a plan to get out of the financial condition we're in. He said there's no need to have one, in my opinion. Then he went on to say at another time, quote, "It would be foolish for us to do a budget," close quote. Foolish for us to do a budget. Well, and they did not do one. There is no budget. And for him to say it's a lie, to say we don't have a budget, is inaccurate. I would just point out, as the Senator knows, that the Budget Act, well, the United States Code defines what a budget is. It says some of the things that has to be a part of a budget and the process for which, how one is produced. It has to be in the committee by April 1st. It sets out the date, April 1st. Then you have to have floor vote by April 15th. And when it comes to the floor, the rule says you have unlimited amendments, 50 hours of debate, then the debate ends. You can't filibuster it. 50 hours, about 1 week, it can be done. 6, 7 days at most.
It's the one thing that can't be filibustered on.
Absolutely. A
There's no
simple
filibuster
majority,
on the
a party with a majority, 53 senators, ought to be able to pass a budget. We passed a budget with 50 senators, 51, 50, I think, one time. This is, and a budget allows you to control everything but Social Security. You can't touch Social Security, but you can deal with Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, pensions, most any, as well as the discretionary accounts. And so that was all avoided. And Senator Wicker, you've been around here and in the House for a number of years, but it seems to me it would have been a healthy thing indeed had we brought to the floor a budget, the Democrats had, even if I didn't agree with it, and then we had a national public debate about these difficult choices the nation faces, and we actually had senators having to vote on them. Do you believe that balancing the budget is worth cutting some spending here? How much taxes are you saying we ought to raise? How much are you really cutting spending? Let's read the fine print. Are you cutting it how much and actually debating and voting on these things? That's what the majority leader and his colleagues wanted to avoid.
And Senator, it's what every city council, every state legislature cannot avoid. They don't have a printing press down in Montgomery, Alabama, or Jackson, Mississippi. And I know the Senator has seen the local delegations, county officials coming in, talking about economic development, and they tell me, Senator, now we've had to cut back on this, we've had to cut back on that, we've had to do this to our budget. We used to be able to afford these things, and we can't afford them anymore. They've made sensible decisions. Councils and legislatures, Republican and Democrat, have faced the hard choices. And it can't be any fun for them. They have to face the voters and say, we paid for this last year. We don't have the money this year. And families have had to do that, Senator.
I couldn't agree more. Just in my hometown, Mobile, Alabama, they fell 1 vote short of raising the sales tax because of the financial challenges they were facing, and they had a big debate about it. But they didn't duck the vote. They had to vote, and they decided that they didn't need to raise the taxes. And it wasn't a question of the city council being able to avoid a vote. But we in the great United States Senate, we travel the whole state over and over and over again, and we asked for this tough job. You know, my wife got a good phrase about it, Roger. She says, when I complain, don't blame me, you asked for the job. You know, we asked for this job. Nobody said it was going to be easy, and this is not easy, because we have never, Roger, been in a more fundamental, we've never faced a more fundamental financial crisis because of demographics and history and trends that are going on, and our population situation is such that it is going to be difficult to meet these challenges.
But you know, we can meet these challenges. I've got grown children, 32, 28, and 25, and they may be about to age into the next year, but they wonder if they'll even receive Medicare when it comes time to retire. You know, that retirement for them will come sooner than they think. It seems like forever, but they don't really believe, that generation doesn't really believe Medicare will be there for them. If we tackle this problem, Medicare can be there for the next generation, should be there for the next generation.
Exactly.
It won't look exactly like it does for my father, who's 88 years old today and depends on Medicare, but Medicare could be there, but not the way it's going now. We've got to tackle these issues.
You are so right. I mean, we're not going to have to cancel these programs.
No, sir.
We can save these programs. It's just going to require